Welcome to Mind Shield. We protect the mind and pursue the truth. Let's get started.
Mind Shield remains anonymous for one reason above all others. The work itself is inherently risky. Not because the evidence is weak, not because the methodology is weak, and not because anonymity is being used as theater. It is a temporary defensive posture in response to a hostile and ambiguous threat environment. This opening slide frames the core logic. On one side is the threat environment, unclear vectors, opacity, and the possibility of retaliation, intimidation, or contamination of evidence. On the other side is the investigation itself, a structured, disciplined process that only survives if it remains protected long enough to mature. So anonymity here is not an identity choice. It is operational architecture. It protects the integrity of the investigation, the physical and digital safety of the team, and the continuity of the work. Most importantly, it keeps the researchers from becoming the story, because once personalities replace evidence, truth starts bleeding out through the floorboards. This slide lays out the 4 pillars of the mission. First, protect autonomy. That means defending the mental and physical independence of people experiencing alleged covert neurosensory intrusion. Second, reduce harm. That means de-escalating distress before confusion hardens into panic, rage, or collapse. Third, preserve lawful options. If victims are ever going to have institutional recourse, legal remedy, or credible advocacy, the pathway has to be protected now. And fourth, build credible evidence. Not social media smoke. Not myth. Sterile, forensic, contamination-resistant data. The key line on this slide is that anonymity allows the execution of these 4 objectives. Public exposure, at this stage, threatens that sterility. Once identities are exposed too early, the mission becomes vulnerable to pressure, narrative attacks, infiltration, and reputational warfare. Evidence must be built before visibility is earned. The order matters. Reverse the order, and the whole structure collapses. This slide is really a risk map. The upper danger zone includes unclear threat vectors, direct retaliation, misattribution danger, and compromise of ongoing work. That is a brutal combination, because ambiguity is where both predators and mistakes thrive. If a team is investigating technologically ambiguous harassment or covert intrusion, there are multiple layers of uncertainty. The source may be unknown. The method may be unclear. The actors may be state, corporate, criminal, opportunistic, or completely misidentified. In that environment, personal exposure creates an operational risk that is difficult to reverse. And there's the deeper issue. Once identities are known, the investigation can be pressured from 2 directions at once: direct retaliation on one side and reputational sabotage on the other. The team can be baited, personalized, discredited, or psychologically cornered. That's why the diagnostic warning on this slide matters. In an unregulated and technologically ambiguous arena, exposure is not transparency. It can become self-sabotage. This is one of the most important slides in the deck because it explains the human danger. The pathway is simple and terrifying. Unexplained pain or intrusion, then isolation, then misattribution of source, then rage or paranoia, and finally escalation to violence. That is not just a theoretical progression. It is the anatomy of what can happen when severe distress meets confusion, and no stabilizing framework exists. The cautionary case here is not presented to sensationalize tragedy. It is presented to show what happens when a person tries to name an invisible threat without reliable evidence, institutional support, or a credible investigative container. The risk is not only suffering. The risk is collision, psychological, social, and sometimes physical. Mind Shield exists to interrupt that pathway early, to reduce isolation, to slow premature conclusions, to keep people from naming enemies before there is proof, and to stop distress from mutating into irreversible harm. That is the moral center of the Anonymity Protocol. This slide makes a distinction that matters. A mask hides deception, but a shield deflects harm. Mind Shield's anonymity is being framed here as a shield, not a disguise. That difference is everything. It protects people by safeguarding investigators, victims, and sources. It protects privacy by preserving the integrity of sensitive victim data. It preserves continuity by ensuring that if one node is under pressure, the entire mission does not collapse with it. And it protects objectivity by keeping public attention fixed on the evidence itself, rather than on personalities, biographies, or attacks against character. That last point is critical. In contested environments, once the investigators become visible, public discourse often shifts away from data and toward projection. People stop asking, "What is true?" and start asking, "Who are these people?" That is a trap. Operational security is not secrecy for its own sake. It is a boundary that allows truth to develop without being strangled in its crib. This slide answers the obvious criticism head-on. The perceived assumption is that anonymity means freedom from proof, permission to sensationalize, refusal of lawful contact, or a theatrical attempt to create mystery. The operational reality presented here is the opposite. On evidence, anonymity requires even higher empirical and forensic standards, because identity cannot be used as a substitute for credibility. On scope, it demands strict limits and a clear separation between fact and hypothesis. On engagement, it preserves legal frameworks and pathways for eventual institutional partnership. And on purpose, it is not performance. It is a clinical security protocol against retaliation. That final line at the bottom is one of the strongest in the whole deck. We hold ourselves to higher empirical standards precisely because our identities cannot vouch for us. That is the right inversion. If you are anonymous, your data has to work harder. Your claims must be tighter. Your methods must be cleaner. The standard goes up, not down. This is the method slide. Raw observation goes in at the top. Log data, EMF readings, acoustic anomalies, medical symptoms, testimony, anything that enters the case file. Then comes interpretation, where correlation is tested, environmental factors are ruled out, and hardware artifacts are identified. Only after surviving that narrowing process does anything exist as a validated hypothesis. That is why the funnel matters. It visualizes disciplined thinking. Pain is not evidence. Confusion is not evidence. Correlation is not evidence. The funnel strips away noise, projection, and premature certainty until only what survives can be named. And the core rule on the slide says it plainly: evidence before assumption. No suspects named. No blame assigned. No grand theory is elevated without hard forensic support. In an arena filled with distress and ambiguity, this is the only way to keep the investigation from being contaminated by wishful thinking, fear, or pattern hunting. The funnel is not just method, it is ethical restraint. This slide is a needed correction for the age we're living in. AI can structure information. It can scrub metadata. It can standardize voice and format. It can help organize raw data, testimonies, and declassified materials into anonymized reports. But it cannot generate evidence, and it absolutely cannot be allowed to fabricate conclusions. That warning in bold is the spine of the slide. AI is not an evidence generation tool. It is a synthesis tool, a formatting tool, a workflow tool, nothing more. This matters because people are increasingly tempted to use AI as a certainty machine. Feed it enough text and it will sound convincing, even when it is wrong. That is poison in a forensic environment. Mind Shield is drawing a clean boundary here. AI preserves anonymity and improves structure, but the truth still has to come from real observations, verified documentation, chain of custody, and disciplined human analysis. The machine can arrange the evidence. It does not get invented. This slide makes something important clear. Anonymity is not being presented as a permanent identity. It is a temporary defensive posture. Disclosure is possible, but only under conditions that reduce the threat and increase institutional protection. The path laid out here moves from the current posture towards safer operating conditions, formal institutional support, legal partnership, And finally, lawful compelled disclosure, if required by a recognized judicial authority. That is a sober sequence. It says Mind Shield is not hiding from accountability. It is waiting for the environment to become safe enough for accountability to function without destroying the mission. There is also a strategic truth underneath this timeline. Legitimacy is strongest when it enters through secure channels first, not chaotic exposure first. Public integration should be the result of evidence maturing under protection, not the gamble taken before the evidence is ready. Light is important, but timing is part of the truth. This closing slide states the mission in plain language. Mind Shield exists to stop two things: human suffering and the escalation of violence. That is the real North Star. The argument of the entire deck is that the invisible nature of alleged covert neurosensory intrusion breeds isolation, paranoia, and danger. So the response must be structured, evidentiary, lawful, and protective. The tools are being built. The evidence standards are being built. The legal frameworks are being built. The goal is to bring what is now hidden into a place where it can be tested, challenged, and judged in the open. And that brings us to the final line. We remain anonymous for now, not to hide from the truth, but to safely deliver it. That is the distinction this presentation lives or dies on. Not concealment from truth, containment in service of truth, a shield, until the work is strong enough to step into the light.